not the architect of any of these developments. I want to simply make this point by showing you some images of the new forms of moral and rational recreation that were championed. So you see here a nice contrast between, does anyone know what this is? Anyone know what these two images are? Really? Really? Very good, the disorderly pub on the left. Melody, you going to have a guess on the other one? Yeah. The other one is the perfect order and sobriety of a temperance meeting. Okay? So here you have a very nice contrast between the pub, which as you can see, well, you can't, shall I turn the light off and you'll see it maybe more clearly. Between the pub, where there is a promiscuous mix of women, children and animals behaving in a variety of dissolute ways, as you can see, as opposed to the perfect order and respectability of a temperance meeting where everyone is dutifully and diligently seated. One of the key things about temperance meetings that was very important was they built their own halls in order to get people out of pubs, and right at the centrepiece of every temperance meeting was the symbolic signing of the pledge, where people pledged themselves to sobriety for the first time, and casted away their immoral and dissolute ways. In many ways, this signing of the pledge, which you did up on this type of stage in front of the assembled audience, was rather like the evangelical conversion of being born again, and it comes directly out of that type of evangelical culture, this idea that you could be born again through signing the pledge. Here we have one of the key organisations of rational recreation that was the Mechanics' Institute. Institutes built for mechanics where they could go and read, where they could go and advance their education. They would go and see plays. There would be all sorts of reading matters. There would be meetings on specific issues and so forth. This is an image of the Mechanics' Institute in Manchester, which was built in 1854. And reading is a very important part, clearly, of the propagation of rational forms of recreation. Okay, now remember, this was also true of the evangelical revival, that the Sunday schools that proliferated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were in many ways about teaching working class children how to read so they could have a more intimate knowledge of the Bible, that many evangelical missionary societies were about propagating useful knowledge and disseminating copies of the Bible, both in Britain and its empire. But there were a series of forms of legislation in the 1840s and 1850s that tried to consolidate this new rational and literate culture. From the introduction of the penny post, where people could write letters to each other for the cost of a single penny, and that would enable the letter to be carried anywhere across the United Kingdom, to the opening of museums and public libraries enabled by the Museums Act of 1845 and the Public Library Act of 1850. In fact, there's a series of public libraries. That was the first one in 1850, where cities with a population of 10,000 could get a library, a free public library, if two-thirds of the ratepayers, the property taxpayers in that locality, voted to have one. Although there were a bunch of other acts there's another one in 1866, it wasn't until 1919 that those restrictions were removed and that localities could build libraries regardless of a vote by the ratepayers or the size of their population. By 1900, there were 295 free public libraries across the country. The other key development here was the repeal of the Stamp Acts. The Stamp Acts that the radicals had called in the early 19th century a tax on knowledge, because for every newspaper published, there was a stamp tax that had led to a surcharge, obviously, on the cost of the newspaper. By 1855, all Stamp Acts are finally repealed, and this led to an enormous proliferation of the newspaper press, and particularly the provincial press. Now, the last thing I wanted to say about this image is that you can see that one of the key things about the public libraries is that they created new types of behaviour internally. Okay, so you'll know, because you all spend, I hope, many hours in the library, that there are certain rules to conduct in the library. One is meant to have one's cell phone turned off. One is meant to generally not be talking. It's meant to be, there's a very clear principle of organisation of all the knowledge in there so that you can find anything that you want, and this was introduced by the Dewey system, obviously created by the American Melville Dewey in 1876. But basically, libraries were like sacred spaces that one moved quietly and efficiently and rationally within. That was the suitable environment for the acquisition of knowledge. So any questions before we move on to the new forms of commercial culture? Yeah, and your name, sorry. Right, from the really from the 1830s, but there's a series of new types of religious practice or spiritualist practice, and you can see that in the middle of the 19th century with occultism, the fascination with occultism. You can see it in the practice of mesmerism, the fascination with how people how people could inhabit a mesmerized state and what that meant. And you can see it in the late 19th century with new, very small groups of spiritualists who become fascinated by trying to literally, scientifically study the soul or the spirit and the communication between the material world and the spiritual world. And there's a whole range of different types of practice that were associated with that that I don't have time to get into. Any other questions? Right. I have lots of audio-visual things to show you today, so this is going to be the first multimedia lecture, so I'll awaken you later with some clips. I want, though, to move on to the new times and the new spaces of leisure that begin to develop. And so first, the thing about time. So the old customary culture was based around a different type of time regime. That is to say, and this is obviously a caricature because people had timepieces in the 17th and 18th century, they were just very rare and not hugely efficient, but generally, for most of the working poor, the regulation of time was by daylight and by church bells. And so one big thing that historians are very fascinated by is how is it that we get a sort of modern form of standardized time, because clearly church bells and the sun varied enormously from locality to locality. Now, as I said, part of this process of a new time discipline came from the commercial proliferation of timepieces that became very fashionable in the 18th century, and especially. But in the 19th century, it's primarily associated with what became known as railway time. the coordination of timetables by railway companies, bearing in mind that there are a myriad of different railway companies trying to coordinate timetables with other companies. And increasingly that was done by way of telegraph systems that often ran alongside railway lines. So you could no longer have a separate time, as is evident. This is the clock from Bristol Town Hall that had two minute hands. The black hand was Bristol time, which, as you can see, was about 10 minutes behind railway time. Now, very few places actually had these two different minute hands, but it serves to illustrate my purpose. So that was the first thing, the commercialisation and the spread of railways. The second was, of course, the new time disciplines of industrial production and of industrial capitalism generally. So the new forms of mills and factories that developed in the late 18th and 19th centuries had very specific times in which people had to clock in and clock out of work. The factory gates opened and closed at very specific times. Mills in the industrial northwest even employed what was known as a knocker-upper. That's not someone who goes to procreate with anyone that they can find. It's someone who goes around with a great long stick, knocking on the top windows of people's houses to make sure that they're awake and they'll get to work on time. And obviously also those mills and factories had their own specific ways of factory whistles or bells or increasingly hooters by the late 19th century to tell workers when their time was to knock off or to have a break, etc., etc. So new types of time discipline came in with new forms of work. And then finally, the third pressure here was the state. The attempt to create a nationally uniform time system. And that begins to happen in the 1870s and 1880s. So in the 1870s, you have the Factory Act and the Bank Holiday Act of 1871 that established a 5.5-day working week from Monday to Saturday lunchtime, 105 hours in that working week. And uniform national holidays. The bank holidays in England are like federal holidays, basically, federally prescribed holidays. And then in 1880 came my favourite piece of legislation ever, the Definition of Time Act. The Definition of Time Act, which created a uniform time system across the entire country and paved the way for the standardisation of international time, which of course became centred upon Greenwich in London. Greenwich Mean Time being south of the river in London. And that system of international standardisation again was made possible by the transmission of through the telegraph system, the rapid expanding telegraph system. So the point is that I'm trying to make here is not that time gets changed in lots of complex ways, although it does. It is that there is an increasingly clear separation of when people should be working and when people should be recreating themselves through leisure. So basically, Saturday afternoon was the beginning of rest time. People would go to the market, women would go to the market to buy food, and men would go to the pub or to any number of sporting activities to watch. And then Sunday would be the day for rest and recuperation and for sort of family time, so that people were ready for work bright and early on Monday. But there are two things that complicate this story of standardisation. And the first is the practice of St. Monday, which is in many places and many trades, had a special customary working week that meant that Monday was their day of rest, that their day of rest would be spread over Sunday and Monday. And it was called St. Monday, and St. Monday actually continued in some areas really quite late. So the Sheffield steel industry, for instance, through to the 1870s, continued to practice letting their workers have Monday off. The other exception is the practice of Waits weeks. Waits weeks were linked to the local saint day of the parish church. Okay? And on the saint day that the parish church was named after, it was the custom that parish would have a whole week off work. Okay? And very interestingly, this pattern of Waits weeks continued to be incorporated into the calendars of many mills in industrial villages and towns. And that meant that different towns and villages had different weeks off across the year, mainly between May and September. Now, someone had a question. Yeah. No, there's no paid holiday at all until the 1930s. And I'll come on to that later. Here we have a great image produced by actually a contemporary artist, Bernard Macmillan, called Waits Week in a northern town. And you can see here people coming out of the steel-working factories and the local fair being practiced in this way. It's done. This painting is done in the style of L.S. Lowry, who became hugely popular in Britain in the 1950s and produced these striking images of people overwhelmed by their industrial environments. The other thing about Waits Weeks, which is really important, is that particularly in the industrial northwest, people would go off to the seaside increasingly on paid excursions by their employer. Their employer would often provide a train to take their workers en masse to a seaside town, which in the northwest was predominantly Blackpool. There were lots of others spread around the country. This produced a great trade in postcards like this one, which you can see is this mill hand transformed from her working environment, a Lancashire cotton mill, to the promenade on Blackpool. And the caption is, "Oh, what a difference." And I'm going to translate the local dialect here. "Don't forget your old pals. See you on Monday, eh?" So just a classic reminder that you might be on holiday, but you haven't escaped the trials and tribulations of a working person. And one quick piece of footage.
When Michelin came in and the showman turned to film any of the factory gate exits in 1900 and 1901, they were usually met by a positive response from the audience and also from the factory owners. When they actually came to Romarsh to film Parkgate Iron and Steel Company in Rotherham 1901, the reaction is not seen to be quite so popular by the local workforce. This would have been filmed on behalf of a fairground exhibitor to be shown at Rotherham Statis, the local weights fair held in November every year, a charter fair known locally as the Statis.
So you get the point here. This is one of the very, very early films, which very excitingly for nerds like me was discovered only about 5 years ago in the basement of some shop. And these films were shot when people came out of the working gates. And the idea was that then they would show them in a hall, and people would go to see themselves on film during the Waits Week. And again, to remind themselves of the fact that they weren't working and that they, to see themselves represented on film for the first time. A very exciting event for many people. And more of these images later. Let me move on, though, if you'll let me race through so I can have time to show you some more clips of the new spaces of leisure. Now, there could be any number of things that I could talk to you about here. I could talk to you about the development of commercialised shopping areas. I think we spoke about new department stores in London's West End last week. I could talk to you about the new seaside resorts and the development of them, places like Blackpool. But the really classic one that I want to talk to you about is the music hall. And that's what I'm going to just focus upon here. Now, the music hall emerges from the pubs. It emerges from people basically providing musical entertainment and sort of variety shows in pub settings like this one here. And they really, this is an image of I forget the name of the pub, that's bad of me, but anyway, it's from the 1860s. Increasingly in the 1870s and 1880s, you have the development of commercialised chains of music halls owned by a company that would put on, would build a series of music halls in different places, like this one here, which again I've naughtily forgotten where it is, but it was built in the 1890s. So it was extracted from the pub, this type of entertainment, from the pub into, and now its own discrete setting. In 1870, there were 31 large music halls in London and about 384 across the rest of the country. And you get the point is if you take them out of the pub and put them into purpose-built halls, you can charge admission prices for people in ways that you can't when shows are being put on in a pub. The sort of golden age of the music hall then is the 1880s, from the 1880s through to the First World War. And music halls become so respectable, they actually have their first Royal Command performance in 1912. What these purpose-built halls by these new chains, and some of them did, was to provide an increased capacity of audience so that they would generate more revenue. That enabled them to provide larger programs, a sort of a larger variety bill. They had melodramas, they had comedies, they had songs. And it enabled the owners of these chains to develop a star system, rather like the early Hollywood film industry, where they would propagate their own stars and then have them travel around their chains. I'll give you one quick clip to demonstrate to you. This is from a film in the 1930s by two big musical stars of before the First World War, Nellie Wallace and Lily Morris. Hopefully this will work.
Why do silly folks, we other folks, good morning. When the morning's always sure to be bad. If your head's like lead and you keep yawning, is it likely that you're going to be glad? A morning in the NBG is always full of sorrow. And one is worse, there's going to be another one tomorrow. What's the use? What's the sense? We don't need no offense, but we won't say good morning anymore. What a hope! What a shout!
Okay, I think we've probably had enough of that. Both of these music hall stars made the transition into cinema, clearly. This is from a film in 1935. Both of them were famous for representing working class life. This is a skit called The Char Ladies, i.e. domestic cleaners. And one of the big things about music hall is that performers actually showed working class life back to their working class audiences. It was a type of entertainment that seemed to many people to be believable because it was closer to their experience. And both of these women actually were famous for playing the part of comedy parts of a frustrated single woman. So Lily Morris' big hit, for instance, was Why Am I Always the Bridesmaid? You know? So here is something that speaks directly to the experience of young women at that time. Not that all young women in Britain were single and frustrated, clearly, because British men are not like that at all. The other point that I want to make about the music hall is that it creates a new type of discipline internally to the audience. And so I've given you three images here to give you some sense of the way in which the new type of dynamic of audience participation or spectatorship begins to develop. So in the first image, in the top left-hand corner, you have a rather unclear division within the audience around tables, the audience being as much part of the show as the actual stage. That would have been very characteristic of the pub environment. Here you have an early hall from the 1870s where you can see that the audience is beginning to look a little like a temperance hall. That you have a regularity of seats rather, as in this lecture hall, and as in this lecture hall, all the seats are facing the stage. And that meant that the owners of music halls could begin to charge differential prices for where you sat. And so the audience began to be demarcated in terms of their social and economic positions. These halls also increasingly struggled with licensing laws. The London County Council in the 1880s began to, the London County Council was created in the 1880s, and it immediately had a very strong representation of people that supported the temperance movement, and there was an attempt to try and get to stop these music halls from having liquor licenses. So one of the big London chains, Stoll's Music Halls, that's S-T-O-L-L, had in 1909 only 8 of their 29 music halls had liquor licenses. And again, this was an attempt to try and make the audience a little more focused on the entertainment and not their own pleasures. But as you know from reading Thomas Wright's Among the Gods, for this week, there are these seats up in the balconies, or right at the very, very top, known as the gods, where there were no seats and where working people could get in very free, including children, not free, but get in very cheaply, including children. And if you read Thomas Wright's Among the Gods, you'll get a great sense of the way in which that part of the musical provided their own types of entertainment, and very importantly, continue to have a critical dialogue with the performers, heckling them, throwing stuff at them, throwing stuff on the polite people on the polite seats down below, and generally continuing to be quite a disruptive presence. Did any of you read Thomas Wright, The Among the Gods? Yeah? So, Oliver, what was the thing that struck you about Among the Gods?